Okay, great.
Ross, hi. I'm incredibly grateful for you taking time out of your diary today, hopefully to share as much as possible about Lenire, which is, I've got to say, without question, one of the most innovative tinnitus treatments that are out there at the moment, and we're fitting it in clinic as well for our tinnitus patients. So I'm keen to get the word out. So I would love for you to start off by giving the Hearing Tracker YouTube audience a bit of an introduction to yourself, and then explaining what you do at Neuromod.
Yeah, so my name is Ross O'Neill. I'm the founder and CEO of the company. So I guess a little bit of background on myself: biomedical engineer by trade. Fell in love with the human nervous system as an undergraduate, studying electrical engineering. Loved that the nervous system was all electricity. And what really captivated me was this concept of neuroplasticity. So the idea that the brain, we used to think that it was hardwired soon after birth, but actually it's not true. It wires and rewires based on sensory input that it's receiving. And that really captivated me. And then going from there, I kind of discovered these illusory perceptual disorders. The most commonly known one is probably phantom limb pain. So, and I read a great article, where this neuroscientist was using mirror therapy to treat phantom limb pain. So he was using it to trick the brain to, think it was doing bicep curls when, instead of feeling this pain in a limb that wasn't there. And around about that time, I guess, my own daughter had profound hearing loss. And I just, was working more and more in the kind of hearing side of things, and I just kept coming across this tinnitus problem. It was just such an ubiquitous problem, and I talked to lots of people, and it just seemed to be everywhere, and it was a huge underserved need. So that was really the kind of the origin of it, and we decided then to pursue the opportunity with this concept of bimodal neuromodulation.
And so, as far as I'm aware, bimodal neuromodulation is something that's being used in other areas to treat various conditions as well. How on earth do you come to the decision to think that this is something you could be using to treat tinnitus? And then where was that kind of light bulb moment when you thought, you know what, we've got this. We're going to be able to do something with this for tinnitus sufferers?
Yeah, so when people ask me, about that, I always say it's pretty obvious, but looking back on it, you had to have read a lot of research papers to kind of to realize it. But I think there was a convergence in the literature that again, a bit like with neuroplasticity, we used to believe that the brain was hardwired at birth. We also used to believe that the brain, organized itself into different sensory cortices, and there wasn't much crossover between them. But it's not the case at all. Actually, the brain is always using one sense to sense check another sense, if you like. And so that was coming out in the literature, and there was more and more literature pointing to really, intrinsic links between hearing and touch. And then at the same time, while I was talking, kind of investigating the clinical need, what a lot of patients said was, if I use hearing aids during the day, it's great because I'm less aware of my tinnitus, but when I take them off at night, the tinnitus spikes and I can't sleep. So what everybody seemed to be saying is that what I want is a long-lasting hearing aid, effectively. And I thought that's something we can build with this bimodal approach, because there is a phenomenon that dates right back to Pavlov and the dogs ringing the bells and feeding the dogs. So that approach is called paired associative stimulation. So if you reinforce one signal going on one sense with a reinforcing signal on another sense, it grabs the attention of the brain. And so, we figured we could hardwire this sound effect into the brain using this paired associative stimulation and deliver this kind of long-lasting hearing aid that the market was looking for.
Okay, so then building on that, for anybody that's not familiar with Lenire and how it works, do you want to give it a breakdown and explain why it's pretty unique as a tinnitus treatment?
Yeah, so it's the first and only bimodal tinnitus treatment. So And, we've now evaluated multiple clinical trials, FDA approval, etc. But it's complete change from anything that's gone before. I think that before it was typically sound therapies or amplification or CBT that they were the standards of care for treating tinnitus. So this essentially is sound therapy. So it's delivering sound therapy through Bluetooth headphones. But you have a controller device that has this little tongue tip on it. It's like a little lollipop that goes in your mouth. And what that does is when you're hearing tones through the headphones, you're also getting activation on electrode on the tongue. What's on the tongue is essentially like a little mini cochlear implant. So it has 32 electrodes and they correspond to different frequencies. So whenever you hear that tone in your ear, you get a corresponding electrode activation on your tongue. And so essentially the sound is coming in through two senses. It's going in through your ears and through your tongue at the same time. And that kind of grabs the human attention through this process, paired associative stimulation. And the problem is with tinnitus that your brain is kind of giving too much attention to this one sound. So what it does is it dilutes it. So you're hearing all these other sounds that we're playing, and and they're getting reinforced. And again and again and again, we do that millions of times over 12 weeks plus, and it gradually just dilutes the amount of attention that the tinnitus percept is getting.
And what kind of sensation will people experience with this tongue tip that they're using? It's not, I think it's safe to say it's not electrocuting them. Is it a mild pulsing? Is it what is it, sizzling? What might it be like?
So it feels like a carbonated drink. So it's very kind of, very good. So yeah, it feels like a carbonated drink on the tongue. That's essentially what it feels like. It's not an intense feeling.
Okay, so no one would have to be worried about any discomfort or pain associated with that. It's more of a distraction, as you say, than anything.
Yeah. It's more about the timing that you're hearing the tone in the ear and you're getting that little sensation on the tongue and you're getting them at the same time. So your brain is going, right, this is important. This is happening on two senses at the same time. We need to pay attention to this. Yeah.
Which goes back to the Pavlovian theory that you were talking about before as well.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess it's pretty safe to say that it sounds a little bit wacky. And I know as well, I hope you don't mind me saying that. And I know from some of the comments that I've had in my videos, I've done a ton of videos on Lenire, and there, as with any new technology, anybody that sticks their head out of the parapet, there can often be quite a lot of skepticism. So I guess one question for you is, what's the hardest battle that you've faced in fighting for getting people to take Lenire seriously?
Yeah, so we could see that there was a lot of skepticism at the start, and it was the reason that we decided, and tinnitus patients have been disappointed by a lot of therapies that have kind of made bold marketing claims without the clinical data to back it up. So we decided very early on, if we're going to take this to market, we had to follow a strategy of credibility building. So we'd work with all the top scientists. We'd do the largest clinical trials ever conducted in the space. We'd publish in all the top journals. We would go the hard route in terms of regulatory approvals, FDA. We'd continue thereafter collecting real world evidence and publish that. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, some of the reactions when I told people I was going to treat tinnitus by basically adding electrical stimulation to the tongue at the start was, I got a lot of funny looks back in the early days.
I can imagine. And you mentioned a few different studies there. So I know you've got a handful of studies out. What are your main findings in these studies then? And are they big scale studies? Are they longitudinal? How would you respond to anybody that actually questions the legitimacy of the studies that you've done so far?
Yeah, so they're as I said, they're the largest studies ever conducted in tinnitus. So and they're the longest followed up as well. So two of the studies are longitudinal studies. So we treated for 12 weeks and then we stopped treatment and we followed up for 12 months to see how long the treatment lasted. So they were Tente 1 and Tente 2. They were submitted for peer review. So they've gone through that rigorous process of essentially, facing, pretty critical scientists peer scientists in the field. And Tente 1 was published as the cover story in Science Translational Medicine, which is it's a top tier, very reputable journal. Tente 2 then was published in Nature Scientific Reports, again, very credible, top tier journal. And then the FDA trial, Tente 3, it was published in Nature Communications. So Nature and Science are top tier in terms of publications. So I mean, it's probably the most clinically evaluated, peer-reviewed treatment that has ever been on the market. I think I can hold my hand on heart and say that. It's also the only one to go through the actual FDA de novo process. So that's another kind of rigorous test, if you like. You have to do a clinical trial. You have to put the data in front of their teams of ENTs, audiologists, clinical scientists, statisticians, and get approval. So yeah, it's the most rigorously tested and evaluated treatment that there has ever been, and it gets highly consistent results. It doesn't matter where we do it, whether it's in Germany, in Ireland, the UK, in the US, we always see the same results. Similarly, now we're starting to track our real world data. So we've just submitted our first real world evidence paper for peer review. So that's very close to getting published now. We'll follow that up with multiple other papers. So yeah, it's just, I mean, at some point, I always say to my team internally, I want it to be like anesthesia. I don't want anyone to ever question that it works. And the way you do that is you publish until you have in the thousands, the tens of thousands, and the millions of patients. So that is what we are going to do.
And I guess from the perspective of de novo approval with the FDA, that is, you have to have some real strong evidence for getting de novo approval, which is basically setting the scene in a new landscape when it comes to any kind of treatment, if my understanding is correct. And so people in the future will be able to piggyback off what you've done already by doing that, but you have to set the rules. You have to actually make sure that there's evidence that this is a thing and this will help people with tinnitus, right?
Yeah. So de novo means first of its kind. So there's never been a bimodal neuromodulation treatment approved by the FDA for anything. So we've created US regulatory history by getting this approval, and we created a new device category, as you say. Then people can now, do 510Ks. Now they will have to prove equivalence, which includes efficacy. And so. Yeah, so it was a pretty big piece of work. Very proud of it. Very proud of my team. And yeah, we did a clinical trial, 3 sites, 112 patients. And so we treated the patients with 6 weeks of sound therapy, and then we followed up with 6 weeks of bimodal. And we had to show that we had a higher percentage of responders with bimodal than we had with sound therapy. And we also then, in addition to submitting that data, we supplemented that with a further body of data from over 200 real world patients, the results were very, very similar. So when the FDA saw that, they said, and then they looked at the safety profile. So the device is incredibly safe. They look at the patient tolerability. So do the patients actually use it? Patient compliance levels. Tinnitus patients are the greatest patients in the world. If you give them a treatment, they will follow their doctor's instructions, as I'm sure you know. So great patients, very compliant, very motivated. So when the FDA compared all that, efficacy, safety, and patient tolerability, then they gave it the approval. So, and we continue to submit, our real world data to them. You don't just finish then. You will continue to monitor your safety data, your efficacy, and constantly feed that back to the FDA.
I mean, the evidence is compelling and the evidence is all very positive. I know there are a lot of skeptics out there. Sorry to go back to the skeptics, but these are the kind of questions that people will be asking when they're watching this video. And there are a lot of skeptics out there questioning some of the methodology used in your studies. So, for example, something that is constantly being commented on in my videos is there's no no blinding element to the trials, the studies, no double blind. There are complications in terms of doing things like that with regards to studies like this, aren't there?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think everybody latches on to the parallel arm, double-blinded, classical kind of drug trial. That is suitable for drugs where you give one, group the active drug and you give the other a sugar pill or, placebo. But for active implantable devices, that's generally not a suitable design. For active stimulation devices like ours, it's also not a suitable design. But there are many, many ways. There are many types of controlled clinical trials. And a single arm repeated measure study is a classic, design used. It's been used. So we had the ENT group. So that was the group we were working with in the FDA. So they had used this single arm repeated measures design in studies with cochlear implants when cochlear implants were paired with other devices. So what they said was, look, we know the kind of efficacy rates of sound therapy, and we know the kind of placebo rates. So we want you to treat patients for 6 weeks with sound therapy. That will flush out the efficacy of the sound therapy and placebo.
Makes perfect sense.
And then we want you to, and if you see a bigger improvement in the second 6 weeks, then we know it's real. And it'd be like if you had an infection or something like that, and a doctor said to you, I'm going to give you 2 antibiotics, and I'm going to give you the first one and then the second one. What will happen? The first one will clear up the majority of the infection. The second one will only have, incremental improvement. But if the second one is even better than the first one, it's pretty powerful, right? So it's actually a harder bar to overcome the single arm repeated measure study than the parallel arm. So I think it's just it's an easy criticism, and we've gotten it again and again and again. And look, happy to defend the design of the trial. It was good enough for the FDA. It was good enough for us. And what I'd say is that, beyond that, we see just such highly consistent data across every study we do. We're seeing it now in the real world data. So, sooner or later, we hope these kind of criticisms will fall away as people go, okay, this thing is for real. It's like anesthesia.
I like that you've referred to your real world data a couple of times. And so whilst performing these studies in a clinic environment is one thing, actually having evidence for it working for real people in real life who maybe won't have that same level of commitment, they won't stick to it as much. It's quite important to gather that information as well. And so what evidence have you got from the real world in which you can prove the same thing?
Yeah, so it's funny, in the real world data, we're seeing that the results are actually better than in the clinical trials.
No way, really?
So yeah. So I'm gonna big you up here now, Matthew. I'm gonna say, so what we're describing, the reason for this is the 3 Ps, right? And in a clinical trial, you evaluate the product. It's a very controlled environment. You evaluate the product and the product alone, right? But in the real world, we're taking a very careful, measured approach as to who we roll the product out with. And what we've realized, that tinnitus experts, or expertise in tinnitus, is critically important in clinical outcomes. So we're now talking about the 3 Ps. When you put an effective product like the Lenire in the hands of expert providers like yourself, who follow well-defined clinical processes that you have developed over years of both training and clinical practice, that's when you get exceptional results. So we're seeing, responder rates of over 85, 90%, multiples of the clinically important difference. So even better results. So the first paper, which is from Dr. Emily McMahon in the Alaska Tinnitus and Hearing Center, her data is coming out soon. She has treated about 400 plus patients now at this point. So when she treated the first 220, we wrote up a paper, and we've submitted that for peer review. So it's almost over the line. and will be published soon. So I'll let you know when that's out, so you can take a look at the paper and maybe talk about it to your subscribers.
I've already, so I've seen the one with 220 people, and I've actually released a video on that already, actually. And again, the evidence is compelling. They're doing a sterling job. And again, there are some elements where I think that it would be nice if we can see more longitudinal data as well, but that can only come with time on such a new product. And so time is key. And you mentioned cochlear implants and the studies that were done before on that. We've had CIs, I think, since the 80s now, correct me if I'm wrong. And, we don't even think twice about whether cochlear implants are beneficial to patients nowadays. So maybe in 40 years' time, we'll be looking back at today saying, man, can you believe how hard it was to prove that Lenire was a product that was going to help people with tinnitus?
Yeah, well, I do speak to people who are involved in the early days, because my own daughter is a kind of candidate for cochlear implants now. She has gotten on super well with a cross system, so we haven't. She hasn't gotten a cochlear implant. But I became very interested in cochlear implants and in Cochlear, the company Medel, and all these, and Advanced Bionics, and talked to lots of people who've worked in the industry for a long time. And it's funny, they describe the same experience that we're experiencing now.
Really?
It's the same kind of skepticism, same controversies. Yeah, because before there wasn't profound deafness hearing market, and so they established it with that technology. So and it was the same kind of controversies, same skepticism, same resistance, but they stayed the course. And I think we recently, well, I say I didn't implant the implant, but the millionth cochlear implant was implanted recently.
Wow, I did not know that.
Yeah. So yeah, it's look, I always say that technology gets better in a kind of a straight line. Confidence around it oscillates up and down.
Yeah.
So but we're absolutely committed to tinnitus. We can see that it is going to take what Cochlear did for profound deafness. It's going to take someone to do that for tinnitus. It needs a category creator, and so we're on a mission to do that. To try consolidate and advance care. For tinnitus patients, because there's just so many of them, and they're so underserved. So it's it has to be done.
I mean, your evidence is showing that, without question, for the right person, Lenire can be a huge step forward. And again, we've seen that with some of our clinics in practice as well. But I guess one question for you, and I'm already moving on to the next thing. We need to get settled with Lenire first. But where do you think that this technology will go next? I mean, do you think that bimodal neuromodulation is just the beginning of a much larger shift with how we treat general neurological conditions? Or do you think that this is it? There's nothing else in terms of what we can achieve with bimodal neuromodulation?
We're already working on improving Lenire. Professor Hubert Lim, who's our Chief Scientific Officer, he's looking at certain stimulation parameters now that look like they could potentially be even more effective than what we're seeing. So yeah, the technology is just going to get better and better and better, and I predict it will start to apply to other indications as well.
You mentioned, I mean, that's very exciting, and we'll see where that goes in the future. Maybe we could do this, have another catch up in a year or so's time, and see if any of your predictions come true with this. But one thing I'm keen on understanding, winding back to some of the skepticism that you've experienced from certainly people who've commented on my videos, and I don't know whether they're audiologists or end users or tinnitus sufferers who are very vocal online, but I'd love to know, how's it been accepted amongst the audiology community? Have audiologists readily adopted Lenire? Have there been any elements of resistance in terms of audiologists adopting it?
Actually, quite the opposite. We're oversubscribed. So in the US, we're now in about 100 clinics, private clinics, and about 50 VA clinics. I think we've over 1,500 on the waiting list to become Lenire providers.
Wow.
But again, we're being very, very careful on how we roll it out, because what we have seen is, you have to put it in the right hands, because the audiologist experience is, and you mentioned earlier that it's really good for some patients and not so good for others. So the audiologists have to be rigorous in terms of candidacy selection and inclusion criteria, all that kind of stuff. And if that's followed, then we get these fantastic results. But if we release the product too widely, too quickly, and if candidacy selection isn't addressed properly, then the results might suffer. So we're trying to, as I said, establish the credibility of the treatment. So we're making sure that our first steps are the right ones. And if you talk to the cochlear implant people, that's what they did in the 80s and 90s,
Yeah.
So if you're launching a new technology that's really innovative, that's into a kind of a very traditional kind of clinical channel, you have to make sure you have to protect the credibility of the technology until you hit that critical mass. As you say, as we hit with cochlear implants, everybody knows now it's great technology. It always was great technology, but as I said, confidence around it goes up and down. See, that's the thing. So you have to manage that as much as anything else.
It's interesting you've mentioned the role of the audiologists on a few occasions now, and of course that's that could be true from any clinical setting. We know audiologists are incredibly important with hearing aids, and ultimately you can have one hearing aid, but it comes as a blank canvas, and an audiologist will set it up one way in one clinic and another way in another clinic. And so the hearing aid isn't the tool, it's the audiologist who's the conduit to getting the best out of it. And I think when it comes to tinnitus management too, you'll have those audiologists that make sure it's the right patient that gets it based on your inclusion criteria, as you mentioned, but also those ones that might need the extra cognitive behavioral therapy that would accompany it as well, and those that could get by perhaps just with Lenire. And I think that's the key to the success behind this. It's not a one-stop shop, one size fits all approach, and you just give it to somebody, say, see you later. It's a 12-week program. And as you've mentioned before, it might not just be 12 weeks, it might be longer as well. It's actually something that requires that ongoing care and support from an audiologist. It actually makes me think of the NHS years ago when we were transferring, it was before my time, but when people were going from analog to digital hearing aids, there was a common misconception that because the hearing aids were going to be so fantastic at that point in time, what would happen is you no longer needed to do any of the counselling, any of the rehab, the hearing aids would do everything. And then the adoption was actually really bad in comparison to what the audiologist thought would happen. And so then over time, they realised that the counselling, the rehab was just as important, even if the tech is better. And so audiologists, make sure if you're going to take on board this tech, continue to work in the way that you do, I suppose, because patients still need you, and your job is safe. Don't worry.
Yeah, exactly. I firmly believe that tinnitus, I don't think direct to consumer or over the counter solutions will ever work for tinnitus patients. I think that they need to be in the care of an expert, and and that's absolutely critical, because there are times where, the number one determinant of success and I'm sure this is true of hearing aids as it is for Lenire. I know it's true of Lenire, but if it's commitment to treatment, absolute commitment to treatment. When we look at our data, so we log all the data, all the usage data on the devices. So when we look at that and see how compliant patients are, that's the number one determinant of success. So the patients who are most compliant are the most successful. It's the same with hearing aids, right? And like there's no point getting a set of hearing aids and leaving them in your drawer. There's all these links now between hearing loss and cognitive decline, and look, it makes sense, right? It's use it or lose it. Your brain needs sensory stimulation and to stay sharp, right? And so if you can't hear conversations, you're not going to get it, right? You're living in a vacuum. And I can tell you the brain abhors a sensory vacuum. It needs stimulation. Now, the right kinds of stimulation, but it needs stimulation. And so, I imagine it's the same with hearing aids as it is with Lenire. And that's really why it's so important. It's the audiologist to ensure the patient is compliant. if they're starting to, kind of, I don't know, like drift away from compliance, to give them that encouragement. Come on now, remember what our goals are, why you're doing this, etc. And then, as you say, making sure the right patients get it. So if they come in saying, I can't hear the TV because of my tinnitus, well, those guys want a hearing aid, really. That's a hearing patient, Whereas if they're saying I can't sleep or I can't concentrate because this noise is in my head all the time, they're the perfect tinnitus patient, right? And so, it's about that candidacy selection. Then how impacted are they? If you measure their THI scores, they're very low, and they're saying that their life is a disaster. It's usually something else. There's a life event or something that has really stressed them out. So they need some CBT and around that, So that's really it. It's about, and you guys can do this with your eyes closed, right? You can probably, by listening to the words they're saying, you can tell in the first 3 or 4 sentences what the patient needs, and that's why you guys are so important, and it's such an important part of the equation.
I'm glad you think so, because we think so too. So thank you. I got one more question for you. Again, we've talked about real world evidence. We've talked about the clinical studies that you've done. But in terms of you mentioned in Alaska they've had 400 patients now. Are there any powerful stories that you've heard from patients that have used Lenire to make it a bit more real for the people that are listening to this or watching this from home?
Absolutely. There are lots of patients, like the product was featured on Good Morning America, which is the most, watched morning TV show in the US. And there was a young girl that, she was stuck, and she was engaged to be married, and was, I guess, her tinnitus was just holding up her life, So she was treated successfully and, got married, got back to where she needed to be. There's lots of other patients, there's a great story, a pilot, Bert Light. He was a retired guy, and he used to fly people who needed medical treatment, in a different state. He used to fly them there for free, but with his tinnitus, he couldn't hear what the radio controller was saying to him. So he needed that gone so he could do his job more effectively. So he was another success story. There's lots of them, and we, these guys are always being interviewed on TV and stuff. And we just have a growing body of those stories. I always say patients believe patients, and I'm sure you'd agree with that. Yeah. So I'm delighted when these patients will come out and tell their story, because I think some of the skepticism that we face, and I know this from personal experience, not with my daughter that has hearing loss, but had another medical condition, that we were on the forums and we were reading on and I always say the internet is the worst thing you can do. Dr. Google is a disaster. So which is why they need to talk to experts like you, right? But you're on the forums and it's not a good place to be. It fills you with fear. And we went to see a professional. We we put together a treatment plan. The outcome was great. We never ever went back to the forums, not even to say, listen, we had a successful outcome, because we never wanted to think about it again, So when we do find patients who are willing to tell those stories, we're very grateful to them, and encourage them to talk to a TV show or a radio show.
Yeah. And I think we need to see more of that, because people are very, especially I find in the tinnitus world, people are really forthcoming in terms of putting the negativity online in forums. I've seen people come into forums and then leave because it's not a healthy place on occasion. And so if you can find a way of getting more people to tell their positive stories with regards to anything tinnitus related, not even just Lenire, but just to share their stories and experiences, I think that the world would benefit from that. Naturally, whenever you come across anything, the first thing you do is Google it now. And it is so terrible to do that. Ross, I think I'm out of questions. That's everything I wanted to cover with you today. So I am so grateful for you coming on and being able to share your story and all the positive things that there is to know about Lenire. And unless there's anything else that you want to add at all?
No, great to meet you. Thank you for the interview.
You too. Thank you. And I'll also say that if there's anybody watching this and they are interested in looking into Lenire, reach out to us at Harley Street Hearing and Musicians Hearing Services, and we'll see if we're able to help you. All right. Cheers, Ross. Thank you.
Thank you.